In the spring of 1953, William Carter had 160 acres to turn. He had one tractor, and he was already late. The frost had broken nearly 2 weeks behind schedule that year, which didn't just delay things, it compressed everything that came after it. And in central Illinois, that meant one thing. If you didn't move fast once the ground opened up, you didn't just lose time, you lost the season. Carter stood at the edge of that field early one morning, boots still picking up mud that hadn't fully let go of winter, and he knew exactly how tight it was. There wasn't a single extra day in front of him. The county agent had already said as much, not in a dramatic way, just flat, like stating the weather. One man wasn't going to turn 160 acres in time. Not that year. Not with the soil still holding moisture. Not with the calendar already pushing into the wrong side of April. Carter didn't argue. He never did much talking when there was work to be done. He listened, nodded once, and walked back to the shed. The field didn't care what anyone thought. It would be ready when it was ready, and then it would stop waiting. That was the rule, and the rule didn't bend. There was no crew waiting for him, no second machine parked under a tarp, no hired hands leaning on a fence post. It was just him, one tractor, and a window that was already starting to close before he even put steel in the ground. What made it worse was that this wasn't new to him. He had been close before. Too close. There were years behind him where the margin had come down to days, sometimes less, where he had worked everything he had and still watched part of the field sit untouched because the weather turned or the machine failed or time simply ran out. He remembered those years clearly. You don't forget the acres you leave unplanted. They stay with you longer than the ones that worked out. And that was the part no one else saw when they said it couldn't be done. They saw the size of the job. They saw one man. What they didn't see was what it cost him the last time he came up short. This year was supposed to be different. Not easier, just different. Parked inside the shed behind him was the only reason he was even considering it. A Farmall Super M, new enough that it still felt like something he didn't quite own yet, more like something he was responsible for. He had put more into that machine than made sense on paper. More than a year's income if you laid it out straight. That wasn't something a man like Carter did lightly. He hadn't bought it because it was new. He bought it because the numbers said it could do something his old machine couldn't. Not just pull harder, but hold that pull hour after hour without breaking down in the middle of the one stretch of the year where you couldn't afford to stop. That was the difference. Not power by itself, but power that lasted long enough to matter. Standing there that morning, he wasn't thinking about horsepower or specifications. He was thinking about time, how much of it he didn't have, and whether that tractor could give him enough back to make a difference. Because that was the real calculation. It always had been. It wasn't whether the work could be done eventually. Given enough time, most things could. The question was whether it could be done before the season moved past him and took the yield with it. The ground was beginning to dry in patches now. You could see it if you knew where to look. The low spots still held moisture, heavier, slower to give way, but the ridges were starting to turn. That meant it was close. Not ready everywhere, but close enough that waiting too long would cost him just as much as starting too early. There was no clean start. There never was. You picked your moment, and you lived with it. Carter turned back toward the shed and walked inside without any hurry. He didn't rush things he could control. The tractor sat where he had left it, clean, checked, fueled. He had already gone over it the night before, same as he had every evening that week. Oil level, coolant, lines, nothing left to chance that didn't have to be. He climbed up, settled into the seat, and for a moment, he just sat there with his hands resting on the wheel, not thinking in any big way, just running through the first pass in his head, where he would start, which direction he would take across the field, how the soil would likely pull in the heavier sections. Small things, but they mattered. They always did. When he turned the key and brought the engine to life, it didn't roar. It settled into a steady, even sound, the kind you could work with for hours without it turning against you. That was what he needed. Not something impressive, something reliable. He let it warm just long enough, then backed it out into the morning, the lights still low and the air holding onto the last of the night's chill. By the time he reached the edge of the field again, there was no one there to watch him start, no one to mark the moment. That didn't bother him. Most work that mattered didn't have an audience. He lined up the first pass, adjusted his position slightly, and lowered the plow into the soil. The ground resisted at first, heavier than it would be later in the season, but the tractor held. That was the first test. Not speed, not distance, just whether it would hold under load without forcing him to back off. It did. He eased forward, keeping the pace steady, not pushing it yet. There was no reason to rush the first stretch. What mattered was consistency. He worked that first hour without looking back, focusing on the feel of the machine more than the field itself. You could tell a lot through the seed if you paid attention. The way the engine responded, the way the tires bit or slipped, the way the soil broke. It all told you whether you were in the right gear, at the right speed, doing what the machine was built to do. By mid-morning, the rhythm had settled in. Pass, turn, line up, drop, pull. Over and over. No motion. No adjustments that didn't need to be made. He stopped once around noon, not because he was tired, but because stopping was part of keeping going. He checked the engine, ran his hand along the lines, looked at the wear on the plow. Everything held. That was another test passed. He ate quickly, standing up, not taking the time to sit down. Sitting made it harder to start again. By the time the light began to drop in the evening, he had been on the machine for close to 16 hours. The field behind him had changed in a way you could measure now, not just see. When he finally shut the engine down and stepped off, he didn't stand there long. He took out the small notebook he kept in his coat, the same one he used every season, and wrote down the number by the light he carried with him. 42 acres. Not an estimate, a number. He circled it once, closed the notebook, and headed back toward the house. There was no celebration in it, no sense of victory. One day didn't mean anything yet. It just told him one thing. It was possible to move at that pace. And if it was possible once, it might be possible again tomorrow. That was all he needed. Not certainty, just enough proof to start the next day without second-guessing the first. Because the real question hadn't changed. It was still sitting there, waiting for him in the morning. Not whether he could do a day like that, but whether he could do enough of them before the time ran out. William Carter had been working that same 160 acres long before 1953, and long before anyone started talking about whether one man could handle it or not. He already knew what that land would give you and what it wouldn't. He didn't learn it all at once. It came the way it usually does, one season at a time, one mistake at a time, one year where things went right followed by another where they didn't, and over time you either paid attention or you paid for it. Carter paid attention. He was born into that ground, grew up on it, and by the time it was his responsibility, there wasn't much about it that surprised him anymore. He knew where the water sat after a heavy rain, not in a general way, but exactly where it would collect and how long it would take to move. He knew which sections pulled harder on the plow and which ones would let you move faster if you timed it right. He knew where you could push and where you couldn't. That kind of knowledge didn't show up in a single season. It came from years where you got it wrong first. When his father was still alive, the work had been different. Horses at first, then the early machines, the kind that ran hot and broke often and demanded as much attention as the field itself. Carter had watched that transition happen up close. He saw what changed when a man went from working behind animals to sitting on a machine. It wasn't easier. It was faster. And faster meant you either kept up or you got left behind. By the time he was running things on his own, that lesson was already set. Machines didn't replace the work. They multiplied whatever you brought to it. If you knew what you were doing, you covered more ground. If you didn't, you just made bigger mistakes in less time. Through the war years, when help was hard to find and most of the men he knew were gone, Carter ran that farm alone. Not because he preferred it that way, but because there wasn't another option. You learned quickly under those conditions. If something broke, you fixed it or it stayed broken. There wasn't anyone coming out to do it for you. You got used to that. Not in a way that made it easy, but in a way that made it normal. A cracked part didn't stop the day. It changed it. You worked around it, or you made it hold long enough to finish what you started. Over time, that kind of work leaves you with a certain way of thinking. You don't assume things will go right. You assume they'll go wrong at the worst possible moment, and you prepare for that instead. By the early 1950s, Carter had already seen what a few lost days could do to a season. It didn't take much. A breakdown at the wrong time. A stretch of weather you couldn't work through. A delay that looked small when it happened, but cost you later when the soil warmed past the point where planting made sense. Those weren't theories to him. They were things he had lived through. There had been a year, not long before 1953, when the window closed on him before he could finish. He got part of the field planted, not all of it. The rest sat there, untouched, while the season moved on without him. That stays with a man. You don't forget walking past ground you know should have been worked and knowing there's nothing you can do about it anymore. That year paid the taxes, barely, and nothing else. The rest of it was just loss. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet loss that carried into the next season whether you wanted it to or not. That was the part that mattered now. Not the size of the job in front of him, but what happened if he didn't get through it in time. Carter didn't talk about that much. He didn't need to. It showed up in how he worked. By then, he had gotten into the habit of writing things down. Not for anyone else. For himself. Small notebooks, nothing fancy, just pages filled with numbers and notes from each season. How long it took to cover certain sections. How much fuel he used. Where the machine ran hot. Where it didn't. When the soil turned. When it held too much moisture. Over the years, those notes added up to something more than memory. They gave him a way to look back and see patterns that you wouldn't catch if you were only going by feel. By 1951, those notebooks were telling him something he didn't like. He was losing time, not all at once, but in pieces. A few hours here, a day there. Enough of it spread across the planting season that by the time it mattered, he was already behind. Most of that loss came from the machine he was running then. It had done its job for years, but it wasn't built to hold up under the kind of load he needed it to carry, not without giving him trouble at the worst times. It overheated. Parts wore out faster than they should have. Some mornings, it didn't want to start clean. None of those things by themselves were enough to stop him. Together, they cost him days. And days were the one thing he couldn't replace. That was when the ideas started to form, not all at once, but gradually, as he looked at those numbers and realized that what he needed wasn't just more effort. He needed more time in the field, and the only way to get that was through a machine that didn't slow him down when it mattered most. That was a hard conclusion to come to, because it led directly to a harder decision. Buying a new tractor wasn't a small step. It wasn't something you did because you wanted to try something different. It meant putting a year's worth of income, sometimes more, into something that had to work the way you needed it to, where you carried that cost with you for a long time. Carter didn't rush into it. He spent time looking at the numbers, comparing what he had to what was available, trying to figure out if the difference on paper would translate into something real in the field. When he finally went to see what was coming out next, he wasn't looking for something impressive. He was looking for something that would hold up. That was the standard. Not how strong it was for a short stretch, but whether it could run all day, day after day, without taking time away from him when he needed it most. The dealer showed him the specifications, talked through what had changed from the previous models, where the improvements were, what kind of load it could carry without losing performance. Carter didn't take any of that at face value. He had seen too many machines that looked good on paper and didn't hold up under real conditions. But the numbers lined up with what he was seeing in his notebooks. More power, yes, but more importantly, a steadier performance under load. That mattered. If the machine could hold its pace without forcing him to stop, without cutting into his working hours, that alone could give him back the days he had been losing. And those days, spread across the entire planting window, could change everything. It wasn't a guarantee. It was a chance. That was enough. When he put the deposit down, he didn't make a big moment out of it. There wasn't anything to celebrate yet. It was a commitment, nothing more. The real question was whether that decision would hold when the work started. His wife asked him one thing about it, and it wasn't about the money. It was whether it would be enough. Carter didn't answer right away. He knew better than to promise something he couldn't control. After a while, he told her the only answer he had. If he ran it right, it would be enough. That was as close as he would get to saying he believed it would work. Because in his mind, it wasn't just about the machine. It was about how he used it, how he managed his time, how he avoided the small losses that added up to something bigger. By the time that tractor arrived and he started preparing for the next season, everything he had learned up to that point was tied into that one question. Not whether the machine was capable, but whether he could use it well enough, long enough to turn a narrow window into a full season. And by the time he stepped into the field in 1953, that question wasn't theoretical anymore. It was already in motion. By the time William Carter drove out to Decatur to see the new machine, he wasn't looking for something better in a general sense. He was looking for something specific, something that could give him time back without taking it away somewhere else. That was the whole calculation. He had already done the math at home, in his notebooks, in his head, over and over again. He knew how many acres he could cover in a day when everything went right. He also knew how often things didn't go right. The breakdowns didn't announce themselves. They showed up in the middle of a run, when you were already committed, when stopping cost you more than just the hour it took to fix it. That was what he was trying to eliminate. Not work. Lost time. When the dealer handed him the specification sheet, Carter didn't rush through it. He stood there longer than most men would have. He wasn't comparing brands. He was matching those numbers against years of his own records. Drawbar horsepower, engine size, fuel capacity, what it could hold under continuous load. That last part mattered more than anything else. Plenty of machines could pull hard for a while. Fewer could keep doing it without forcing you to back off. And backing off, even slightly, over the course of a long day, cost you acres. Acres turned into days. Days turned into missed windows. He had lived that chain enough times to recognize it before it happened. The Super M, on paper, broke that pattern. Not by a wide margin, but enough. Enough to matter if everything else lined up. That was always the condition. If everything else lined up, Carter didn't fool himself into thinking the machine would solve the problem on its own. It wouldn't fix the weather. It wouldn't make the ground dry faster. It wouldn't run itself. What it could do, if it held together the way it was built to, was remove the weak point that had been costing him time year after year. That was the bet. Not that it would make the work easy. That would make the work continuous. When he put money down on it, it wasn't a decision made in a single moment. It was the end of a process that had already been moving for months. The numbers had pointed him there first. The dealer just confirmed what he already suspected. Still, that didn't make it comfortable. Writing that check meant committing to something that had to pay for itself in the field. There was no margin for it not working. Not for a man running one operation on 160 acres. When a machine arrived later that year, Carter didn't treat it like something new and exciting. He treated it like something that had a job to do. He walked around it slowly, not out of admiration, but out of habit. He checked the spacing on the rear wheels against his rows, measured it, adjusted it, looked at the air intake, the electrical system, the connections. Things most people wouldn't notice unless something went wrong. He didn't wait for that. He checked it before it had the chance to fail. The first time he started it, he didn't push it. He let it run, listened to it, paid attention to how it settled under its own rhythm. A machine told you a lot if you gave it the chance. Whether it was going to fight you later. Whether it ran clean or strained under load. Carter learned that early, and he never ignored it. Through the fall and into the winter, he prepared in small ways that didn't look like much if you saw them one at a time. He set up fuel where he would need it. Made sure tools were close enough that he wouldn't waste time walking back and forth when something needed tightening or adjusting. He thought through how he would move across the field, not just in terms of distance, but in terms of efficiency. Where he would start, how he would avoid unnecessary overlap, how he would keep his turns clean and tight. None of it was complicated. That was the point. Complicated plans broke down under pressure. Simple ones held. By the time spring started to come back into the ground, Carter had already made most of the decisions that would matter. Not because he could predict everything, but because he knew that once he started, there wouldn't be time to stop and rethink the basics. The work itself would take all of that. What he needed before then was clarity. No hesitation when the moment came. The delay in the frost that year didn't change his plan. It compressed it. That was the difference. Everything he had prepared for still applied. He just had less room to make it work. That was when the pressure started to build in a way that didn't go away at the end of the day. You carried it with you. You thought about it before you slept and when you woke up. Not in a way that stopped you, but in a way that sharpened everything. Every hour started to count more. Every decision mattered a little more than it would have in a year with better conditions. Carter didn't talk about that pressure. He adjusted to it. The days leading up to when he would finally put the plow in the ground weren't dramatic. They were quiet, repetitive, checking the same things again, walking parts of the field, testing the soil by hand, seeing how it broke apart, how much moisture it still held. Waiting, but not passively. Waiting while preparing to move the moment it made sense. There was a point where waiting stopped helping and started costing. Knowing where that line was made the difference between getting ahead and falling further behind. When that line came, Carter recognized it. Not because it was obvious, but because he had seen it before. The ground wasn't perfect. It never was. But it was workable. And workable was enough. The morning he decided to start wasn't marked by anything special. No one told him it was time. He made that call himself, based on everything he had seen and everything he had learned up to that point. That's what all the preparation led to. Not certainty, a decision. Once he made it, he didn't second-guess it. That was another habit he had built over the years. You made the best call you could with the information you had, and then you committed to it. Doubt didn't help once the work started. It only slowed you down. When he pulled the tractor out and headed toward the field that morning, everything that had been building for months narrowed down to a single line of action. Get the plow into the ground. See how the machine holds. See how the soil responds. Adjust if needed. Then keep going. That was the plan. Simple. Direct. No extra pieces. And as he lined up that first pass and lowered the plow, he wasn't thinking about the full 160 acres anymore. He was thinking about the next few hundred yards. Because that was how you got through something that size. Not all at once. One pass at a time, held together long enough that the sum of it added up to something bigger. The moment the steel cut into the soil and the tractor settled under the load, the waiting part was over. The bet was in motion. And from that point forward, everything depended on whether what he had chosen, what he had prepared for, and how he worked would hold long enough to carry him through the days he didn't have to spare. He was back on the tractor before the lights settled in fully the next morning, not because he was trying to prove anything, but because the first day had told him something important. The pace was there. The machine held. Now the question was whether it would hold again and again after that. One day didn't mean much. 2 or 3 started to mean something. By the time he dropped the plow into the ground on the second morning, there was no hesitation left in how he worked. He didn't ease into it. He picked up where he had stopped, same speed, same depth, same pattern across the field. That was how you tested something properly. Not by changing variables, but by holding them steady and seeing if the result repeated. The soil pulled a little differently in some sections, heavier in the low ground, lighter along the ridges, but the tractor didn't force him to back off. That was the difference he was watching for. Not whether it could do the work, whether it could do it without interruption. He kept the hours long, close to what he had run the first day. Not because he had to prove endurance, but because the math demanded it. At that pace, each full day brought the total down in a way he could track. He didn't think in terms of finishing. He thought in terms of remaining acres. How many were left? How many he could remove from that number before the day was done? By midday on the second day, he already knew something had changed. Not in the field, but in the margin. The margin had widened just enough that he could see a path through it. Still narrow. Still unforgiving. But there. That was enough to keep going. Without overthinking it. He stopped once to check the machine, same as before. No signs of strain. No overheating. Nothing working loose. That consistency mattered more than anything he could have added with effort alone. When he shut it down that night, the number he wrote in his notebook wasn't just a record. It was confirmation. The first day hadn't been an outlier. It was repeatable. That was when the work changed from a question into a process. He followed the same pattern through the week. Up early. Start as soon as the ground made sense. Work until the light dropped too low to see the lines cleanly. Stop only when stopping helped him keep going the next day. He didn't take breaks the way most people would think of them. He took them when the machine needed checking or when pushing further would cost him more than it gained. That was the discipline he had learned over years of working alone, knowing when to keep going and when to step off long enough to avoid a bigger loss later. By the fourth day, the field looked different in a way you couldn't miss. Large sections already turned, clean rows laid down behind him, the untouched ground shrinking in a way that started to feel measurable. That was when the pressure shifted. Not gone, just different. At the start, the question was whether it could be done at all. Now the question was whether anything would interrupt it before it was finished. Because that was always the risk. Not the work itself, but something breaking the rhythm. A part failing, a line cracking, a stretch of weather moving in at the wrong time. Carter didn't think about those things in a worried way. He accounted for them. He checked the machine more often now, not because it had shown any weakness, but because this was the point where a failure would matter most. The further he got, the more there was to lose. That was the part people who watched from the outside didn't understand. It didn't get easier as you went. It got heavier. Every acre completed made the remaining ones more important, not less. He worked through that without changing his pace. No sudden push to finish faster. No cutting corners. That would have undone everything. Consistency was what got him there. It was what would get him through. Sunday came, and he didn't take the tractor out. Not because of habit, not because of rest in the way people talked about it, but because that day gave him something he needed more than another run in the field. Time to go over the machine without the pressure of the clock. He cleaned it, checked every point that had been under load, made small adjustments that would have been easy to ignore during the week. That day was part of the work, even if it didn't look like progress from a distance. Monday morning, he was back at it, same start, same pace. The number of remaining acres was low enough now that he could begin to see the end of that phase. He didn't let himself think too far ahead. That was another habit. You stayed inside the work you were doing. Looking too far forward made you careless. He kept his focus on each pass, each turn, each section of ground as it came up in front of him. By the time he reached the last stretch, there was no change in how he approached it. No push to finish faster just because the end was close. He treated it the same as the first. That was why he made it through without losing time. When the final section was turned and there was no unworked ground left, he didn't stop and look back over it. He didn't stand there and take it in. He noted the completion the same way he had noted everything else. In his book, 14 days, not 18, not the number he had been planning around. 14. That gave him something he hadn't expected when he started. Time back. For days. On a job like that, for days wasn't extra. It was everything. It meant he could move into planting without being forced into bad conditions. It meant he could choose his timing instead of reacting to it. That was the real advantage. Not finishing the plowing. Finishing it early enough to matter. Planting began without delay. He switched the setup, adjusted for the new phase, and moved straight into it. The pace changed slightly, not in intensity, but in precision. This part wasn't about covering ground as fast as possible. It was about placing each row the right way, at the right spacing, at a speed that kept it consistent. Too fast, and the spacing broke down. Too slow, and he lost time he couldn't afford to give back. He found a balance quickly. The machine allowed it. That was the point of everything he had set up. By the second day of planting, he had settled into another rhythm, different from plowing, but just as steady, row after row, keeping the lines true, watching the spacing, making small adjustments as needed, but never enough to break the flow. The weather held. That was something he couldn't control, but it mattered. He didn't waste it. Each day added a clear portion to the total, and the remaining acres dropped in a way that mirrored what he had done in the plowing phase. Controlled, measured, no surprises. By the time the week was out, the last of the seed was in the ground. 7 days. That was all it took. He finished before others in the area who had more help, more machines, more resources. He didn't compare himself to them. That wasn't how he measured the result. He measured it against the window, and he had made it through clean. When the planter came out of the ground for the last time, the work that had been hanging over him since the start of the season was done. Not partially, completely. Every acre covered, every row set. There was nothing left in that phase that could slip away from him. For the first time since the frost had broken late, the pressure that had been sitting just behind everything he did eased off. Not completely. There was still a season ahead. But the part that could have undone it all was behind him now. And the only reason that was true was because nothing had broken the chain of days he had built from the start. Not the machine, not the conditions, not the pace. He had held it together long enough for it to count. And in work like that, that was the difference between a season that held and one that didn't. The corn came up the way it's supposed to when everything lines up, not all at once in a way you notice from a distance, but evenly, steadily, row after row breaking through the soil within the same narrow stretch of days. Carter saw it first in sections, the early rows showing green, while the later ones followed close behind. No gaps, no uneven patches that forced you to question what went wrong. That was the first sign the timing had held. Not perfect, nothing ever was, but close enough that the field behaved as one piece instead of a collection of separate problems. He didn't say much about it. There wasn't anyone he needed to explain it to. He walked the rows the same way he always had, stopping where something looked off, checking the spacing, the depth, the condition of the soil around the roots. What he was looking for wasn't growth. Growth would come if the foundation was right. He was looking for consistency. That was what the early planting window gave him, and that was what he had been working toward from the beginning. By the third week, the stand was clear, strong, even covering the ground the way it should when the timing is right across the full field. That was when most of the doubt left, not all at once, but enough that he could move through the rest of the season without carrying the same weight he had at the start. The work didn't stop. It never did. There were still passes to make, still things to monitor, still decisions to handle as the weather shifted and the crop moved through its stages. But those were the normal parts of season. The part that decided whether the year held or failed had already passed. As June moved in, the field filled out. The rows closed. The ground between them disappeared under growth that moved at a pace you couldn't see day to day, but could.